Hello and welcome back to another episode of All Bodies, All Foods. I'm Sam. I'm here with Ashley. And boy, do we have an episode for you. I'm so excited for this one. And we're really going to dig in to a lot of new ideas and speculation. We have Dr. Lutter here with us today. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So, I read your book. I have it right here, actually. It's called Genetic Information for Treating Eating Disorders. And I have to say, I've obviously read quite a few books, especially being on this podcast. We have lots of authors on, and I always appreciate, all the books I've read, I've appreciated them so much. I've learned so much, and it's really been enriching. But this book, your book, changed my perspective completely on eating disorders.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And I mean that. And that's why I couldn't wait to get you on the show because I have a million questions for you. And
Yeah.
I can't wait to dig in. But before we do, um, I'd love to get to know you a little more. You're a psychiatrist, you're a scientist.
Right.
What got you into this field? Why eating disorders? Why do you think we all need to understand genetics and eating disorders? Why is this important?
Um, so, I mean, my background story is not all that interesting. I was a MD PhD, so I did a combined program to train medical scientists. So you do 2 years of medical school, and then you do your PhD, and then you do the last 2 years of medical school, which are the clinical portion. And my PhD, this will make sense at the end, but was on this like very basic biochemistry of mitochondria, which are the part of the cell that are involved in like metabolism. So then I left my PhD, and then I did 2 years of medical school where you did everything. I mean, I delivered like 10 babies,
Oh,
you
wow.
help with surgeries, you go to family practice, you go to psychiatry, internal medicine, you kind of see this broad, spectrum of human biology. And I just thought psychiatry had the best questions remaining. I thought we had the most interesting questions left to answer, like what is a mood, and what's a memory, how memories formed, and what's an emotion. And so I decided to go into that. And then, so I did a psychiatry residency. And I had the first 2 years of that to then rotate through all the psychiatry clinics and wards and just kind of see everything, schizophrenia. And we worked in the emergency room and depression and bipolar and personality disorders and all that. And I was just most fascinated by my time on the eating disorder unit. I worked at the old Presbyterian unit in Dallas when it was still around. And I was just fascinated. I knew a little bit about metabolism and appetite regulation, and it just seemed to me so clearly that there was a sort of a biological component to it. Not to diminish the psychological part, but that there had to be a biological component as well. And there was just, at that time, 2004, there was just nothing known. That's 20 years ago, 21 years ago now. And so I'm just, scientists, we run into the darkness, right? We go toward where there's no, the best questions are, where we don't know anything. And fairly naively, I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to go study this. It seems really interesting and important, and we don't know much about it. So, um, so I start studying it, and everybody's like, oh, you did your PhD on, the mitochondria. You're gonna have to learn all this new stuff because it's not relevant. And here I'm 20 years later, and almost everything I've done has taken me back to the mitochondria, right? Like
Yeah.
most of what I do now is just
Yeah.
based on mitochondrial biochemistry and how problems with metabolism, especially in the mitochondria, lead to all these like psychiatric disorders. And it was this, it turned out to be a really good education, but at the time you would never have guessed it.
Right. Who knew? Well, thank you for running into the darkness because now we have your book and we're going to have this episode and I'm just so thrilled to get into it.
So, Dr. Luter, when you are working with patients and their families, I'm imagining that people come in with all sorts of ideas about genetics. And I'm curious what some of the biggest myths and misconceptions are that folks might come in with in regards to genetics and mental health, but also genetics and eating disorders. I feel like, yeah. This is something that is asked a lot about in
Is
our
that,
field.
yeah.
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 I'm just so
Yeah,
curious
I
about it.
I have to be very. I spend a lot of time on psychoeducation because you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
There is a strong genetic component. You know, I estimate it's probably 50-50. Environmental and stress and trauma, and then
Yeah.
in psychology, and then the other half, biologic, of which genetic is a part. And so I try to explain to families, that there is a genetic component, and yes, you likely some of these genes were passed along by family members, but it's not your fault. You're not to blame. Nobody does this intentionally. If people without any genetic disorders were the only people that have kids, that nobody would have any kids, right? So
Yeah.
you're not to blame, but there is a genetic component, and if we can understand that a little bit better, maybe it'll give us some insight, some new treatment
Hmm.
opportunities. So, the numbers are interesting. If you say the risk of developing an eating disorder is about 50% genetic, um, and you say that a first degree family member of a person with an eating disorder is about 5 times more likely to have an eating disorder, that's still only about 5% of the population, right?
Hmm.
So, or talking about anorexia, I should say, I should clarify, not all eating disorders, but with anorexia, you're about 5 times more likely to have anorexia if you have a first degree family member. So the majority of people still don't have an eating disorder. 95% of people still don't get it. So you are a little bit more likely to develop an eating disorder if you have a first degree relative, but it's not absolute. It's not like guaranteed that that's going to happen.
Right.
So
Hmm.
try to explain to people that we're really just using this as an opportunity to learn more and try to do treatment, and we're not like placing blame on anybody, and nobody needs to feel guilty about anything that they pass along to their child. It's kind of usually where I start off, trying to explain the value of understanding the genetic component.
Hmm.
That's so important because I do think that the guilt, the fear, all of
Hmm.
that can really get in the way of someone supporting a loved one in recovery. And sometimes even like their willingness to start a family. I know there's people who are
Mm.
scared to pass on their
I get
eating
that a lot.
disorder. Yeah. And there are some people who think there's like an eating disorder gene. And, we often have to explain, well, there's many, many genes at play. And
Right,
these
Mhm.
right.
genes are very common and the environment plays a role as well. It's not just the genes. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about eating disorders, genetics, and mental health.
Yeah, exactly. And it can be very hard to kind of explain a lot of the background because, like you said, it's a combination of, how did the genetics make you vulnerable to this environmental stress, right?
Right,
How do,
right.
how do those two interact with each other?
Yeah.
And a lot of people ask me a question, did the eating disorder cause the mutation? I'm like, no, you're born with the mutation. These are, passed along through generations. They're probably, been passed through many generations. So it has nothing to do with the eating disorder or, with your food that led to the mutation, these mutations or this risk. And there is some risk of passing along to your child. But like I said, even if you do have an eating disorder, there's a 95% chance that your child is not going to have one. So I always tell
Mm.
people, be aware of it, but don't let that be the deciding factor on whether you have children or not.
Right, right. And there's also so many protective factors that we can put in place to protect mental health and reduce risk. And so we try to educate families on that as well. I would
Exactly.
I would love to dig into just what we know so far from the genome-wide association studies. I got really into this. This was like fascinating to me when
But
the PGCED came out with they partnered with Angie and they came out with a paper in 2019. The PGC is the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium for anyone who is wondering what that acronym is. And
Mhm.
Angie is the Anorexia Nervosa Genetics Initiative. So they kind of got together and we're learning a lot very quickly about genetics and eating disorders because we have the data is available and the results of this research, it's like coming out pretty rapidly. So I was hoping we could just start there with the basics. What are the genome-wide association studies? What have we learned so far from them about anorexia? But I think more importantly, what are some of the limitations to the research?
right. So as you mentioned, it's not just one anorexia gene. If it was, we would have found it a long time ago.
Yeah.
It's, there are, thousands of mutations in hundreds of different genes, all of which can increase your risk. The important thing, the first thing I would like to clarify is that like not all mutations are created equally, right? There is a spectrum of mutations. So some mutations give a very small amount of risk, but they're very common in the population. You know, it's 10, 20, 30, 40% of the population. Some of them are very damaging. They give you a much higher risk, but they're fairly rare. You know, it'd be like 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million. So the example most people would understand would be the breast cancer genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, BRCA1 and BRCA2. So mutations in those genes give you about a 40 to 70% chance of having breast or ovarian cancer, but it accounts for only about 1 to 2% of all cancers, breast cancers. So the risk is high if you have that mutation, but most of the cancers are not caused by that, right? So those would be the rare, highly damaging variants. So that's what I'm interested in. That's what I look at. What the GWAS studies do are they look for those common variants that give a small amount of risk. Okay, so the ones that are generally found throughout the population, but maybe only increase your risk a small amount. So what a GWAS study essentially does is collects thousands of cases of people and compares them and looks all along all these markers all along your DNA, and it asks the question, which of the variations in the DNA are more commonly found in people with a condition, in this case anorexia, versus the general population. And they go through millions and millions and millions of different DNA variants, and they find the ones that are more commonly found in people who have, in this case, anorexia. And so they can say statistically, you are more likely to have the disease if you have this variant. So this was the study that came out in 2019. I've got it pulled up here. This was out of the, like you said, the Angie group. These studies are gigantic. They're very, because it takes so many people and so much computers and computational and all of this. These are gigantic studies. They're millions of dollars. They've got all of these authors that are involved. So these are huge undertakings. So, you know, my hat's off to these people. These are genetic, large groups of people who do that. And when they did it, they found 8 genetic variants, so changes in the DNA, that if present are associated with a higher risk of having anorexia. So the value of these studies they are common. You know, most of these variants, like I said, are in like 10, 20, 30, 40, you know, one is even in like 90% of the population. The downside are each one individually only accounts for a very small percentage of the risk, the genetic risk of developing anorexia. And from my perspective, the other limitation is it's hard to tell which genes are being influenced by these mutations, because only about 1% of all of your DNA encodes for genes. The genes are the parts of the DNA that make your proteins. And most of these variants are in between genes. So it can sometimes be difficult to identify exactly which gene is being influenced by this specific mutation. So it can be, you know, there are all these tricks you can do to try to figure it out, but it can be a little difficult to figure out exactly what the biology is. Like, how is this variant, like, what is it doing on a biological level to increase your risk? But they were able to find these 8 variants, and then you can do what's called a polygenic risk score, where you like add it up, and if people have like based upon the number of these variants you have, you can sort of predict, you know, how likely somebody is to have an eating disorder, and you can do different types of studies by combining a lot of these different variants.
So the more of the 8 that you have, the higher your risk of developing anorexia.
Right.
We should add that the GWAS, people with anorexia were the only ones included. Isn't that right?
In this specific study.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to make sure our audience knows that this is actually just for people with
the
anorexia.
one was the first one.
Yeah.
Bulimia, no, a binge eating GWAS that came out from the Veterans Affairs study. That came out last year. And then I believe the same group that did the Angie group, I think they are working on a binge eating or bulimia study as well. So that should be out hopefully relatively soon. The other real strength of this is because you've got so many people with all these different variants, you can then compare it to other conditions and see what associations there are between the genetic risk for anorexia and then other conditions or measures or things like that. So they found a positive correlation. So meaning that that people who have this risk for anorexia also share a risk for OCD, which is not terribly
Mhm.
surprising. You know, this is
Right.
known
Yep.
for a long time that people with anorexia are more likely to have OCD or obsessive personalities.
Right.
Major depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, again, not terribly surprising. Neuroticism, higher levels of education, college completion. Um, and then they did some what are called anthropometric, so just measurement type of things. So less likely to have insulin resistance, lower fasting insulin levels, less likely to have type 2 diabetes, higher HDL cholesterol, lower body fat, lower body mass, just in general. So um, from those observations, the theory came about that anorexia is what the term is what psychometabolic disorder, I believe, in which metabolism, in part, is what underlies some of this risk of developing anorexia. It's not just purely psychological; that there are likely metabolic disturbances as well that increase your risk of having the disorder.
Right. And this was kind of groundbreaking because it sort of gives us some evidence that these are not just psychological disorders, but they're also rooted in these metabolic factors. And,
Mhm.
for example, it seems like folks with anorexia, correct me if I'm wrong, folks with anorexia are more likely to have a smaller body to begin with.
Yes.
Yes. And so there's something about the symptoms of anorexia restricting that makes it more likely they're going to get to very low weight compared to some other restrictive eating disorders.
Yes, they seem to have a genetic risk of just being at a lower body weight, being unable to sustain a higher body mass. Yes.
Right, right. So there's these metabolic factors that are genetically built in that makes someone at elevated risk of having anorexia. And maybe even it helps explain why some folks with anorexia tend to return to lower weights and relapse because they're sort of working against their own biology in recovery.
Um, I I think that's true. I think it is harder for these folks to maintain their weight, and I can't remember the study, but I believe there was a study a few years ago that the people who settle into long-term recovery tend to be a little bit under ideal, quote unquote, ideal body weight. So they do have
Mm,
this tendency to kind of settle in a little bit less than you would expect just based upon the typical methods used to estimate ideal body weight.
right, right. So this is such fat. This study, this 2019 paper really fascinated me. And then I really feel like you have insights that take it even a step further. You talk about these variants that are common and they're responsible for some amount of risk, but then there are these variations that are much more rare, but end up creating more serious issues. I think you used a really good analogy in your book. I can't remember it off the top of my head. I think, was it like shards of glass?
Yeah, yeah. So the analogy I used was like, like a large chandelier like crashing to the floor, right?
Mm.
And you could either get hit by like lots of tiny little cuts, like little slivers, flying, and cause a lot of small cuts. That would be like the risk that you get from a GWAS, or you might get hit by like a single large cut, right? A single large slice of glass like coming and hitting you, and if it hits you, you're in big trouble. But if it misses you, you're completely fine. That's a little
Mm,
bit how it goes with some of these rare variants. If one of your parents happens to have, one of these rare variants that dramatically increases your risk of having the disorder, it really is kind of 50-50 whether or not you inherit it or not.
right. So we're going to dig into those bigger shards of glass in just a
Right.
minute. Yes.
Yeah, I am fascinated right now. Just taking all of this in and Sam, what you said, thinking about the folks we've worked with anorexia fighting against their biology, that I mean, that puts things into a little bit of a different perspective for me, um, and kind of understanding this and what our clients may be experiencing. Um, And so, Dr. Lutter, I'm curious, in your book, you write that anorexia remains one of the most poorly understood illnesses in medicine. I'm curious why you think that is.
Uh, we could dive into. I mean, the simple answer is it gets eating disorders in general get less funding for research than almost any other field of medicine.
Mm.
Like I don't know if it's still the case, but a few years
Really?
ago, the NIH, the National Institute of Health,
Yeah.
I think we were like second to last in terms of diseases, in terms of funding.
Wow.
If I had looked at that before I decided to go into research, I probably would have picked a different field. But there's very little money that goes into the research. So it's like 1/10, like literally like 1/10 of schizophrenia, 1/10 of
Wow.
bipolar, 10th of autism. Um, Even though we're probably 10 times more likely or more prevalent than those disorders.
Yeah.
So there's just a lack of research, and to a lesser extent, I think it's still considered, not within our circles, but in the general population, I think it's still considered largely a disease of choice. It's a behavioral condition. A lot of people still think it's just young women trying to be thin to get attention, which
Mhm.
obviously is not the case.
Right.
But I think there's a lot of that. So the for whatever reason, the eating disorder field has not been able to advocate with politically for funding the way other groups have. You look at like autism, that field has really exploded in the last 20 years in terms of their funding.
Mhm.
The eating disorder population has not really, or communities really not been able to rally together to be effective in increasing funding for whatever reason.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I feel like we're lucky to have the research that we do. I mean,
Mm.
we have twin studies, family studies. We now have the GWAS studies, and I guess we can just hope that research will continue to be funded because this is really important stuff. I mean, one of the things that came out of the 2019 paper that really stuck with me was this idea that, maybe we're going to get to the point where we're going to be able to identify many different subtypes of anorexia.
Mm.
And I've always had a hunch about this. Just working in the field, you start to realize that no two cases look the same. And
Right. Yeah.
especially with anorexia, there just seems to be way more, I don't know, differences between clients. Some folks, it seems to be really rooted in obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. And then for other people, it seems to be something different that's happening. And I could never really put my finger on it. But when I read that, about these different subtypes, and then you actually in your book talk about, you also think there are many different subtypes of anorexia. How many do you think are out there?
Mm.
That's a good question. With binge eating and bulimia, there's clearly four major genetic clusters that I found, and maybe a little bit of a fifth. With anorexia, the most common um, pathway that I find involved in restriction is metabolism of fats, of lipids. That's about 45% of patients have a mutation in a gene related to metabolizing fat. And then it's about 25% amino acids, so proteins, a few small percentage of people with carbohydrates. Um, and then there's a few other pathways I found. So there's a subgroup of patients I have who have mutations in genes related to synthesizing dopamine. So they have deficits in making dopamine and serotonin or norepinephrine. They tend to have a very dense depression. They tend to be mostly depressed, don't respond very well to traditional antidepressants. And they don't eat much, so oftentimes they'll end up in eating disorder treatments, but they don't have that sort of the classic drive for thinness. It's much more like apathy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they respond much better to different types of interventions. So there's at least five groups that I find. I'm sure there's much more. It depends on how much you want to drill down on it.
So you just dropped some major bombs right now.
Yeah.
Let's back up. Okay, so there's a group of people that you believe, out of all the people who have anorexia, there's a group of people who cannot metabolize a certain amino acid.
Yeah, so it's mainly the essential amino acids, right? So so the proteins in your body are made up of 20 amino acids. And then is it I think 11, is it 9 or 11? It's it's one or the other. Let me look that up so I don't embarrass myself. Essential amino acids.
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I remember you said it in your book that there were certain amino acids that the body makes, but certain amino acids you have to get from
Yeah.
eating. Yes.
Not okay. There are 9 that you essential amino acids. So meaning dietary essential.
That you have to get from food.
Right, that you have to get from the food that you eat.
Right.
So the patients with anorexia are much more likely than the general population to have mutations in genes related to metabolizing or breaking down those amino acids. So you can use the amino acids to make proteins, and if you have extra, or if you're like fasting, then your body can break down protein and use that as energy. So that would be things like the branched chain amino acids, which is leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And then the other common ones I see are lysine and tryptophan. So mutations in those pathways are all much more common in people with restrictive type eating disorders. And this is anecdotally, but you said I was welcome to speculate. So anecdotally, people with a higher burden of mutations in genes related to metabolizing amino acids tend to be more vegan or vegetarian, right? They tend to really avoid really high protein meals. They tend to get much, or especially animal sources of protein. They tend to be much more likely to get it from plant sources of protein.
Well, that would make sense because eating those amino acids make them feel awful, I imagine.
Yeah, my my new view of anorexia and ARFID is that people create aversions to foods that their body cannot metabolize effectively, right?
Wow.
So it's sort of like intuitive eating, but in sort of like a different way. Like the body knows what it can't break down, can't metabolize, and it somehow that message gets back to the brain, like, okay, don't eat that.
Right.
Because a lot
That's
of these
huge.
a
That's
lot of these
huge,
intermediate
right?
products are like toxic. There are things like
Yeah.
butyric acid, which is like a brain toxin. So if you can't metabolize some of these factors, they actually build up as these products that are like toxic to neurons.
That is so like that's mind blowing
Like
to me
mind
right now.
blown, right?
I'm
Yes.
thinking of folks with like celiac and just how
Yes.
they respond, to the gluten, to the wheat, and how it just like really hurts their stomach and the rest of their functioning in their body, how this actually like a certain protein might make them feel a certain way, like you said, and to where they develop this aversion and they may not even, cognitively know where that's coming from. But I'm just thinking of our sweet clients that are like, this doesn't feel good. This is hurting me. This doesn't feel good. And how that could be the case for them.
Yeah, I feel incredible guilt because I worked for 4 years at the University of Iowa, and I attended when they still had a program, and we were very proud that we would give them bacon every Wednesday morning. Iowa, obviously, big
Yeah.
big pork, and it was like every Wednesday morning, like everybody got bacon, and it was Bacon Wednesday, and everybody had to eat it. And I'm thinking back now, like, oh my gosh, what were we doing? Like maybe bacon was not the best option for them.
Right,
Yeah.
right. These like fear food challenges that end up actually making recovery a lot harder for them.
Yeah, I mean, like I know the standard is to the fear foods and exposures, and I want to be very clear that I don't know if that is good or bad anymore, right? Like I'm not saying
Sure.
don't do exposures anymore.
Sure.
The evidence is not out there, but it is an interesting thought that the fear foods people develop may have a biological basis, and it may
Mhm.
really make them sick.
Right,
So
right.
like I rethink everything now.
Well, yeah,
So
because we thought when people would say this that it's so subjective. Like, is it really harming you? How do we know? Right? Like
right.
that is, yeah.
Right. Like, is this a medical issue or is this really rooted in the eating disorder?
Yeah.
And according to, all of your work, Dr. Lutter, it just seems like there is a small segment of the anorexia population that may have this mutation. And in those very specific cases, treatment really does need to be tailored, especially the meal plans.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially. I know
We're not
we're
there yet,
speculating. Yes, we're
but
not there
yeah, I
yet.
mean,
Yeah.
it could very well be that we will have macronutrient selective meal plans in the future. Like right
Right.
now, I'm working on helping. So Guido Cromer is doing the ketogenic diet study out of the University of California, San Diego, and I'm helping a little bit with it to analyze the genetics of these folks. So I have not seen the data. I have no idea if it works or not. But the idea that eliminating carbohydrates or fats or whatever or low protein diet may be a potential treatment is very different than what this current standard is.
Yeah.
Right, right. So there's this very specific variation that has to do with breaking down amino acids. That really could be approached the same way we would approach celiac disease. We always say
Yeah.
all foods fit, except if there's a medical issue. And in these cases, I mean, there is a medical issue. There's
Could be.
a variation. There could be. And so you also talked about there being a variation that affects the ability to break down carbohydrates.
There is. So there's a disease called citrin deficiency. It's a disease. So we did a talk on this, I work with the Citrin Foundation. There's a foundation that works on this. It's a rare
Oh,
and
wow.
inherited metabolic disorder. So last March, they did a presentation on this. And those folks have difficulty breaking down carbohydrates and then large amounts of protein as well. So they tend to have a very strong aversion to carbohydrates and alcohol. And the treatment there is just to have less carbohydrates. There's a couple other things you can do, but basically it's backing off of the carbohydrates. So I
Wow.
found a couple of cases of citrin deficiency in the patients that I work with. So it's not like super common, but it's not rare either.
Wow.
Wow. Okay, so we have two subtypes. What were the other subtypes?
So
One
the
was
most common
dopamine.
problem in people with restriction is in metabolizing fats, especially
Okay.
long chain fatty acids.
Long chain fatty acids.
So that's
Okay.
so I've looked at this in two different genetic cohorts now. It's about 17 to 18% of patients, so a little less than 1 in 5 patients that I look at have mutations in 1 of 5 genes that are involved in importing long chain fatty acids into the mitochondria to be metabolized down into energy. So it's what's called the carnitine pathway. There's a series of proteins that are involved in moving fats into the mitochondria to be turned into energy. And people with restrictive eating disorders are much more likely to have rare, highly damaging mutations in those genes.
Wow. And
Right. No, I remember there was an animation that you had to help explain this,
Right.
where what happens is the brain sort of mistakenly thinks that the body has enough nutrients.
Possibly. I don't know the exact mechanism,
Yeah.
but you can clearly see in these patients that they have impairments in metabolizing long chain fatty acids. So fat is very toxic to cells, right? So you have to, the body has all these special ways of holding on to fat because it's like a detergent, it's like soap, and it breaks down the membranes of your cells if you have too much free fatty acids floating around. So there are all these special machinery, all these special proteins that are involved in holding on to the fats and escorting them into the mitochondria to be turned into energy. So patients with restriction are much more likely to have mutations in these genes. And you can see the buildup of these byproducts. There's a pathway that the body has to get rid of these toxic fats called omega oxidation. And it creates these types of fats that can then be excreted through the urine. And those levels are much higher in people with restriction. So you can actually see that it's more common for people with restriction to have impairments in this beta oxidation process, this process of breaking down fats. So that part is very clear. What I don't know is then how that signal, that stress signal, goes back to the brain to stop eating fat. That part I'm still working out. It's not, I've got a theory, but I don't know for sure. But you can observe these very clearly in people with restriction. And in some of the cases, you can actually treat it. You can give back things like a carnitine, acetylcarnitine, and that will, if somebody just can't make enough of it, and that will improve the functioning of the system. And I wouldn't say they become asymptomatic, but they have a lot more energy, less brain fog. They tend to have lower levels of eating disorder thoughts, a little bit better, meal plan completion and variety. So you can sometimes actually go in and intervene in the system to kind of make it work better. And people do get better, but again, this is speculation. We need to really like do large scale studies to prove whether or not this is an effective treatment or not.
Wow.
Right. And then, okay, so there was also a mutation that you talk about, I think with atypical anorexia. Um, would you be able to talk a little bit about that?
Do you remember which gene it is? I don't remember.
Let me think. So I think you talk about how sometimes there are certain people who, when they're feeling distressed, they are less likely to eat, they have less of an appetite. I wonder if this has to do with the dopamine.
It could be the dopamine group.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then there's a couple of other pathways. It's not just metabolisms. So I estimate about 77% of my patients, who are mostly of European descent, have a mutation in one of these genes involved in metabolism. So that's the most common pathway I see. But then there's this subgroup of folks who have problems with making dopamine. That's not that common. I have 5 to 10 patients like that. And then the other one are circadian rhythms. I see a lot of circadian rhythm patients. So there's a lot. There's a much higher rate of what's called delayed sleep phase syndrome than I really appreciated. Especially working in a treatment center in which you force everybody onto the same schedule. So it's very common for people to have these disorders where they tend to be night owls. They tend to be people who prefer to go to sleep at like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the morning and then sleep until like noon. So they're usually missing breakfast. They usually have very low appetite for breakfast. First meal of the day is around noon. Then they'll have dinner with their family. And then a lot of them will have, a third meal on their own, like 10, 11 o'clock at night, and then go to bed at like 1 or 2 in the morning. So their circadian rhythms are shifted. A lot of these times, when you're like in high school or something like that, and you're forced to get up early in the morning, you just don't want to eat breakfast. It would be like me waking up at like 1 in the morning and like having my breakfast. Like I'd be like, no thanks.
Right.
So they look like restrictors because they skip breakfast, they eat a very small lunch, and then they come home and they eat all these calories, in the evening and at night, and they sometimes get labeled, like binge eater.
It sounds like night eating
Or
syndrome.
night eating, yeah.
or night eating
Yeah.
syndrome, right? When a lot of times it's just like misalignment of the circadian clock. And there are some treatments that you can do, some behavioral treatments you can do to kind of better align the circadian rhythms, but those tend to be a little bit harder to treat.
Wow. Okay, so did we hit those big shards, the ones that we wanted to, those rare mutations that seem to
Yep,
affect
I think that
eating?
covers like most
Yeah.
I've seen.
Ooh, really mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm curious, so we have the diagnoses like bulimia and binge eating that were not included in the genome-wide association studies that we were discussing earlier. And what we have learned so far about these diagnoses based on family and twin studies that have been conducted, what are your thoughts on the role of genetics and their impact on the symptoms such as binging and purging?
Yeah. So bulimia and binge eating. That's a great
Yeah.
question. So there is one GWAS study, like I said, it came out last year from the
Yeah.
Veterans Affairs study. And that what they linked was iron metabolism. They found iron metabolism was associated with increase or mutations in genes that typically associated with iron metabolism were associated with higher risk of binge eating.
Interesting. Meaning
Yeah,
that they're not absorbing iron,
I
or what
I
does it
don't
mean?
I don't know. I don't know what the link
Yeah.
is. I, it's a great question. It's one of the beautiful things about genetic studies are they're completely unbiased, right? Like you
Yeah.
look at everything, you look at all
Yeah.
20,000 genes and you have no idea what's going to come out of it. So
Yeah.
it's a fascinating finding. And then, like I said, I think the Angie group is working on a binge eating study. There have been, we've done some smaller studies, family-based studies, in which we found a few things. Back in 2017, we reported the most in that study, we reported we sequenced all the DNA of or all of the genes of 100 patients with eating disorders, and the most common mutation we found in bulimia was in GLP-1 receptor. So 4 out of the 39 patients with bulimia had a mutation in either GLP-1 or GLP-1 receptor. The funny thing is, back when I first started giving these talks, I had to explain to everybody what GLP-1 was. Now I don't have to
Not
explain
anymore.
Right.
That's such a
Everybody
hot
knows.
topic.
Common
Yeah.
phrase.
So, obviously that's gotten a lot of attention. I think there's clearly a subgroup of patients with binge eating and bulimia who have low levels of GLP-1. That we've known that since 2012. The first paper showing low levels of GLP-1 in patients with bulimia came out in 2012. There was a second study, I believe, that came out later that showed the same thing. So we've known almost 12, 13 years now that patients with binge eating bulimia tend to have lower levels of or a subset of them have lower levels of GLP-1.
Dr. Lutter, could you just explain what that would look like? Like, what does that mean if they have a lower level of GLP-1?
So GLP-1 is a satiety hormone. It's released by a specialized set of cells in your intestines that sense the presence of mainly fat, but carbohydrates and proteins. So in the presence of nutrients, GLP-1 gets released.
Okay.
And has a number of functions involved in metabolism. So it increases insulin release from the pancreas, and it sensitizes the action of insulin. So that's where you get the diabetes treatment part. It goes back to the stomach to slow gastric emptying. So it makes you feel more physically full. And then it goes to the brain where it has many effects. It is the GLP-1 receptor is present in the brainstem and then into the dopamine neurons. So it's thought to have very powerful effects on I guess the term I've seen now is called anti-hedonics. It decreases pleasure seeking by the dopamine system,
Okay.
and it seems like maybe it suppresses pleasure seeking in response to a number of different things, not just food. So that's how the system works. So people who have mutations in the system in response to food have blunted release of GLP. So they don't release as much of it. So they don't feel as full or satisfied as somebody who has a higher level of the hormone would.
And they might be more pleasure seeking.
Right. So they continue full, and they don't feel full, they don't feel satisfied, and they want to continue eating, even if they're like physically very, uncomfortable.
Okay.
Right, which fits right with the criteria of binge eating disorder and binge eating episodes, feeling like, maybe eating to the point of feeling so full that that's really the only message that you have, that maybe you had enough. This is really fascinating. And there are probably people in the audience who are thinking, well, I have binge eating disorder or I have bulimia. And if this is a GLP-1 issue, should I just get on, a semaglutide, should I just do that? And I was hoping you could say a little bit about some of the risks.
I know it's very controversial. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a difference between taking the medication at a high dose to pursue weight loss and taking it to actually correct an issue with GLP-1.
Right. So I have prescribed it for people who have mutations in their system. You can't measure GLP-1. Like you could like thyroid hormone or insulin or something like that.
Because it's only like in your system for like what, a couple minutes?
Yeah, the half-life is like 1 minute. So
so you can't go in there and check it quick.
Yeah.
Right.
So the only people who can measure it are like these specialized labs and universities who can like immediately stabilize it and stop the degrading process. So you can't go and measure it, which would be ideal. But they're very powerful medications. So in the people who have these mutations where they don't make enough GLP-1 or don't release it, the medications work amazingly well. They work, really very quickly, and people have symptom relief at very low doses very quickly. But there are risks, that is what I would call a physiological dose of the medication, right? So you're taking somebody who's low and you're getting them back up into the normal range. So that's what you would do with, say, type 1 diabetes or hypothyroidism. What the pharmaceutical companies are doing is they're giving massive doses. They're giving what we call a pharmacologic dose or a supraphysiological dose. So they're pushing the system. They're giving much, much higher levels than you would see in somebody naturally, and they're creating this pharmacological effect. So that I don't know as much about. I know that there are risks at the higher doses, gastroparesis, severe constipation. It can cause tachycardia, so racing heart. I will say that there's a number of people I've seen who have this apathy syndrome. So at really high doses, They don't report being sad, but they report being very apathetic. They have no motivation. They don't want to do anything.
Well, that makes sense if it's suppressing dopamine.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it's anti-hedonic, so like this is probably serious, but I probably took more people off GLPs last year than I started on GLPs. Right? So I had a lot of people who came in who got started on these medications, and then they're like, I'm coming in for depression. And I talked to them, and, this started like right after they got put on, like a maximum dose of,
Yeah.
Ozempic or something. And we
Right.
pulled back on the dose, and, all of a sudden they can focus and they concentrate again and have motivation. So there are definitely risks. Unfortunately, we don't have the tools really to identify who would benefit from these medications versus who would not.
Right.
Mhm.
Maybe in the future we'll be able to like measure levels after a meal, like a glucose tolerance test, something similar to that, but
Right.
it's not available yet.
Right. Right. I mean, maybe one day it could be a very useful medication
Mhm.
for people to very specifically target people who have those mutations that
Right.
affect GLP-1 hormones. Okay, let's talk about what you do. I want to make sure I'm saying this right. Exome sequencing.
Exome. Yeah. So basically I look at that 1% of all of your DNA that codes for the genes.
So your clients come in and you sit them down and you explain to them, I'm going to look at your DNA and figure out what mutations you have so you can individualize the treatment plan for them.
I try to, yeah.
You try to. Yeah, you're very
That's
humble. I
Sometimes it
appreciate
works,
that.
sometimes
Yes.
it doesn't. Yeah.
But this is really cool. I mean, so how do you go about this? How do you look at someone's DNA?
So technically it's very easy. It's a cheek cell swab. So it'd be similar to like a COVID test, except you don't even go into the throat or the nose. It's just the cheek,
Wow, no blood.
no blood. And then you
Huh.
send that off to a lab. And so there's enough information in your DNA to fill a book that would be like 400,000 pages long, right?
Yeah, I was
Oh my
thinking to myself,
goodness.
how do you
So-
kind of comb
no.
through
So
all of that?
it's amazing. What they essentially do is it would be like the equivalent of taking a book, several thousand copies of a book that is 400,000 pages long, and putting it through a wood chipper. And then you have a supercomputer read millions and millions of fragments of paper and recreate the book by lining up sentences, right? That's essentially what they do is they just read millions of fragments of DNA and then recreate it by overlapping it, overlap. And then, you'll get like 100 letter, each position all along, you'll get like 100 letters or whatever. And they recreate everybody's DNA based upon reading tiny fragments. And then they analyze it and compare it to what's called the reference. The reference is just what is the most common letter at each position along the DNA. And then they flag that. They flag any time that you have a DNA change from what is the most common. And then they put that into a spreadsheet that's a few 100,000 lines long, and they send that to me, and then that's what I analyze.
And then you can
Wow.
find the smaller pieces of glass and those big shards.
I don't find the small pieces, but I can
Okay.
find the shards.
You can
Yeah.
find the
Mhm.
shards.
Yeah,
And
if
then
there's
that tells you,
Yeah. So if there's a mutation that's running through a family, I can usually find it now.
wow.
Is that something that's available everywhere, Dr. Luter? Like, so you're in Dallas, I'm an hour north of Nashville. Like, is this
But I don't think it's I don't know if anybody else is doing it for eating disorders. It's becoming more common for autism. So
okay?
it's almost the standard of care now for autism. There are some other places that are doing it. I don't know of anybody doing it for eating disorders. So probably will be soon.
See, Ashley, I'm like looking at you and your mind is getting blown
know.
the way, like
The
now
whole
you're
time.
experiencing the mind blown effect. Yes.
I've been
So,
soaking it up.
yeah. So, okay. So just quickly to give an example, let's say someone comes to you and they've been diagnosed with anorexia and they've tried treatment, nothing seems to work. They've sort of been labeled as the severe and enduring case. How might your exome sequencing help them? What would you maybe change to their treatment as usual?
So what's something we would find? Okay, so this would be the best case scenario.
Yeah.
Okay.
Most common mutation I have found in anorexia is in the gene called BBOX1, BBOX1. And this mutation is in about like I can't remember the exact percentage of the population, but it's less than 1% of the population, but it's close to about 5 to 7% of people with restriction have this mutation.
5 to
The other one,
7%.
yeah,
Okay.
is involved in making carnitine. Carnitine, we talked about earlier, is that molecule that's involved in helping metabolize long chain fatty acids and then certain amino acids, right?
Mhm.
And there's a paper out of Japan that came out recently that showed something like 40% of patients with eating disorders are deficient in carnitine. So they have low carnitine, right? So people who are deficient in carnitine just have less ability to break down long chain fatty acids and certain types of amino acids. And you can measure this. It's pretty easy to measure carnitine, although it's a little bit tricky on sort of interpreting the data sometimes.
I was going to say, is this like in routine lab work, or
No,
is it, you
not
need
in
a
routine
you
lab
need a
work, but you can
special
order it.
test?
Yeah,
Really?
you got to specially order it, but you can order it and then analyze it.
Oh my
So
gosh.
the best case scenario is somebody comes in, they have a B box mutation, or there's a couple other genes, TMLHE and ALDH9A1. So if they have one of these mutations, you can measure, you can look at the carnitine's low, and then you just give it back. It's a supplement. You know, they take 500
Wow.
milligrams twice a day. It's dirt cheap. It's pretty safe. And you can see improvements in their metabolism. You know, you can see some of these toxic byproducts decreasing, and people tend to report, like I said, better energy, less brain fog. I wouldn't say that eating disorder thoughts go away, but they're sort of quieter.
Yeah.
That would be like the best case scenario.
Wow.
So
Can we send everybody your
Well,
way? Please.
how many of these can you do a day, Dr.
know.
Lutter?
I can do about 2 a week. Right now,
Okay.
like,
We have more than
Yeah.
that. So
Just a
yeah.
few.
Wow.
but yeah,
Oh
but
my
it's not covered by
gosh.
insurance yet. So I'm I'm trying to get a IRB approved so I can go back retrospectively and then
Yeah.
anonymously report some of the findings because
Yeah.
it's much more. It's going better than I thought. The other really, this is the thing that has really blown my mind from the DNA. So the other thing besides just the fact that people can't metabolize fat is like about 4 to 5% of the patients I sequenced. I wouldn't say don't have an eating disorder, but they have a genetic disorder that probably explains their eating issues better, right? So
Mm.
citrin deficiency would be one of the examples,
Yeah.
but I found a few other like really like rare cases of of metabolism, metabolic disorders, genetic disorders. I found a case of suspected cystic fibrosis that they didn't know about.
Wow.
So that hasn't been confirmed yet, but that was another thing that we found. So probably 4 to 5% of patients coming out of getting treatment, coming out of treatment centers, probably have a medical disorder that mimics anorexia or at least significantly affects the course of the
Contributes to it. Yeah.
and that's not even counting the the immunological component, the mast cell activation syndrome, the celiac disease, things like that.
Right.
So it could be 5 to 10% of patients have an undiagnosed medical condition that's really impacting their treatment. That was the other really big surprise that has come out of this. So it's not
Yeah.
infrequent for me to find other things that are contributing to the eating disorder.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of benefits to getting this done because it just will reveal things about you biologically that maybe you didn't
It could
know.
be, and then and then there are cases where I can't find anything, or I
And
find
then you
something that you
can't
can't
find
treat it.
anything.
Yeah.
But
So
that
I guess
also
that's the
gives you
best
an
case scenario
answer.
where you.
I mean, I was thinking to myself, worst case scenario, I guess someone comes in and pays for this and nothing really comes back. That still does give some information because then we know
Sure.
maybe this is, we can approach this more from an emotional perspective, more from a psychological viewpoint. To rule it out at least has value.
I think that. I don't think the patients think that.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm sure it's really validating to, find out that you have
It can be
some
very validating.
mutation,
Yeah.
or variation, and it can be maybe a letdown when you discover that there isn't really a genetic explanation. And at the same time, you're getting important information either way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just in awe. I'm taking it all in right now.
But when it works, it's amazing.
Yeah.
I bet.
I feel really bad, like there's a lot of cases I just can't do anything, and I'm like, like treatment as usual, but
Yeah.
I found a lot of new things that a lot of times it's very simple things like riboflavin deficiency is like surprisingly common.
Mm.
Riboflavin is B2, vitamin B2, and it's very important for metabolism, especially of like fats and fatty acids. That turns out to be way more common than you'd realize.
Mhm. And what does that do in someone if they have that deficiency?
So
What
if
do
you have
we?
so so riboflavin is involved in like sucking the electrons out of food to create energy, right? So if you don't have
Okay.
that, again, you can't metabolize food, and you get
Yeah.
a buildup of these products like glutaric acid. Um, so you can give back riboflavin. Um, a lot of the B vitamins are deficient. Um,
Mm.
a lot of these cofactors are deficient, and they're easy. It might turn out that this is like uniquely suited toward treating anorexia because a
Sure.
lot of these cases are just deficiencies in, you know, vitamins or cofactors that can be easily replaced.
Mm.
Mm.
Wow.
So it's not like a cure. It doesn't like there aren't many cases where it completely goes away, but a lot of times it helps. Um, so um, what I'm doing, I'm kind of doing a series of talks this year, and one of the things I've done is just what are the most common things I found
Yeah.
uh, deficiencies in, and then like how do you go and you measure those, and then how do you treat them, right?
Mm.
So that you don't need to be able to read DNA exomes, right?
Mm.
Because it took me like 10 years to figure out how to do this. But most dietitians would be able to, read a metabolic study and like see where the deficiencies are and be able to go and like correct those deficiencies. So I'm trying to come up with a way that's much, that I can
User
teach.
friendly.
More
Yeah,
accessible.
that
Yeah.
other people
Yeah.
can use.
That's
Wow.
awesome.
I know. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. What are your hopes, Dr. Luter, in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, what do you hope all of this information, this genetic information, where do you hope we land a decade from now?
Decade.
Or
Uh,
maybe sooner, hopefully sooner.
I hope it inspires a new generation of researchers to come in, and really look, are there certain macronutrients that people with eating disorders can't metabolize? Are there deficiencies that we can go in and treat, and can we tailor meal plans? There's a lot of work that's going to go into that.
Yeah.
It's going to be very hard work, but that would be my hope. Is I think from a biologic angle, we'll be able to go in and do a lot of things that will really help the patients as well as like on the psychological side, that just help the psychotherapy be much more effective.
Right. And I think that's such an important point that eating disorders aren't just genetic. I mean, even when you have these mutations that are found, I mean, there's still an emotional, relational
Yeah.
component. There's still a cognitive component. I mean, all of these things, of course, it's all connected. And at the same time, eating disorders are complex. There isn't one cure. There isn't one thing we can point to say, okay,
Right.
this is going to, guarantee recovery. And so it's oftentimes interdisciplinary and it's a really, complicated approach because it's a complicated disorder.
Yeah, what I tell people is what I mainly do is I try to target treatment interfering symptoms, right? I try to target the symptoms that prevent people from doing the work in therapy and with their
Mm,
dietitian to really heal from all of this. Uh,
yeah.
and that's really my goal, is to try to like use the biological stuff to kind of help keep people in treatment, help them be able to kind of go through the work that they need to do in order to really get better from this.
Yeah.
Well,
So
Dr.
that would be
Luter, I just want to thank you for your work, and I want to like shout it from the rooftops that we need more research in our field. That was even kind of shocking to hear you say that we, have some of the lowest funded research out there. So whoever the powers are that be that want to come support you and all the work that you're doing, come
oh,
on.
what's funny is I don't have any research funding. This is all self-funded. I spend,
Wow.
tens of thousands of dollars of my own money a year doing this stuff.
Yes.
Wow.
That's amazing. Thank
It
So,
you.
is.
Thank you for your concontribution. That's incredible.
but yeah, it's much better than applying for NIH money. So I'm much happier out of academia.
Yes.
The book is called Genetic Information for Treating Eating Disorders by Dr. Michael Luter. Wow. Thank you for writing this book. I really appreciated it and it really changed the way I think about eating disorders. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. That's kind words. And I appreciate you having me on and look forward to catching up with you all again here in the future sometime. Okay.
Thank you so much.